Together with my colleague Allison Garland, we've been managing the Comparative Urban Studies project here at the Wilson Center with a number of colleagues who have left the Wilson Center but are still very much embedded in this project. We're happy that Mishgan Masumi has been able to come back from California for this meeting. I think many of you know Mishgan really was pulling together the seminar series for much of last year. Joe Tolchin, I'm going to pass on a message from Joe at the end. Joe Tolchin, who together with several of us started the Comparative Urban Studies project back in 1992, couldn't be here but wanted to be here. This is the last meeting in a seminar series. It's been a year and a half, and it's been carried out in conjunction with our colleagues at USAID. So, as always with last meetings, there'll be a lot of people to thank, but I'm going to say that to the end because we won't get started if I thank all the people who need to be thanked. But I wanted to acknowledge Mishgan's presence and Joe's greetings in the beginning, and also to thank, again, our colleagues from USAID. This particular seminar series, of which this is the final meeting, has examined global trends affecting urban poverty, such as migration, youth populations, and crime. It's also seek to identify innovation in responses to those problems, innovation in terms of services, infrastructure, and we've tried to bring together academic specialists, community activists, and policymakers in a forum looking at each of these subjects. Each of the papers that's been presented in this series of seminars, including today's papers, will be included in a volume that will come out before the end of the year of all the papers, and will be made available like the other 10 reports that have come out of the seminar series will be made available both online and in hard copy from the Wilson Center. So I just wanted to mention that you don't have to necessarily come up right afterwards and fight for PowerPoint presentations, although you're welcome to do that if you like. There will be a full presentation in published form of all the reports of all the seminar series before it's over. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with biographical information because time is short and the biographies have been made available, and with this many distinguished speakers, it would take forever to verbally go through the biographies. What the format will be is we're going to hear from Richard Stren and then from Susan Parnell. We'll have time for a brief discussion in which you can ask questions that are specific to Richard and Sue's presentations. Then we'll take a coffee break and we'll come back and we'll have two more presentations from Mila, Freire, and Jessica Toludo. But the idea is that there will be a general discussion towards the end. So the immediate questions following the presentations will be about what each presenter said, and we'll return to the general discussion later. So with that, let me just turn the floor over to Richard.
Thanks. Okay. Okay, my name is Richard Stren, and I am more intrigued by the title than I was before, because I'm not sure I've actually been able to manage the paradox that the title shows, but I'll try to do it, and I'll try to explain why I chose this title in the first place. Okay, what I'm going to present is some rather random ideas because this is just a preliminary outline before I write the final paper. I'm glad we were let off the hook by Blair, who indicated that eventually there will be fully published papers. Well, this is not a fully published paper, and I didn't even start to think about this until about 2 weeks ago, but I've been thinking about it pretty intensively for 2 weeks, and the consequences are some of these ideas which I'll put forward somewhat as a stream of consciousness, but I hope a little bit more than that. But I'm very interested in your comments, and I don't know what Sue is going to say, and I'm particularly also interested in what she's going to say. The question that I addressed myself to is, why is there, or should there be, I mean, these are two separate questions, urban assistance, and I think my take, I'm edging toward the ought part of that. Why ought there to be urban assistance? I should say that the way I'm going to proceed here is first to give you a little bit of what I've learned, or should I say acquired, or being exposed to would be even probably a better expression, after 40 years of doing research, consultancy, writing about and thinking about and teaching about developing country cities. I live in Canada, but although I do teach a course in politics in Canada, in Canadian cities, my primary interest is in the way cities have developed, and particularly their politics in countries south of Europe. Okay. First, I'll start with a very brief history of some of the higher points, in my opinion, of the of the urban assistance effort. Then I'll talk about the significance of urban assistance. Then I'll talk about where I think urban assistance ought to go following this seminar. When I started to work in Africa, it was actually in 1965 when I first went to Kenya. At that time, there was no evidence whatsoever, at least in Kenya. Maybe there had been in a few other countries, but I'm not even very sure, of any assistance coming from the outside except from the pre-existing colonial structure. In Kenya, my study was of housing policy during the 1960s and 70s, and I first came into contact with some evidence of outside influence when I looked at the financing for two very large physical housing estates for the poor in the city of Mombasa, which is the second largest city in Kenya. There had been other housing estates built in Nairobi, but this was a very big one that I studied. And the only influence on the design or conception or kind of analysis of what was necessary for that housing estate that came from the outside was simply money that came from the Commonwealth Development Corporation, which was part of the settlement in Kenya for taking over the White Highlands, but it wasn't really focused on cities, and it was filtered through the country's bureaucracy. So there was, at that time, at least in 65, 66, 67, very little evidence of anything coming from the outside. There had been, however, Ford Foundation support for a major planning initiative, which we read about and we later taught about in Calcutta. And this was holistic planning, and it was a very elaborately developed program which started with demography and ended up looking at redevelopment of some areas in Calcutta. And it was spearheaded by, I think he was a sociologist demographer called Colin Rosser. Later on, the USAID certainly had been very active in Latin America during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the USAID was strong in housing, and the USAID was pushing low-cost housing, and it had a RUDO program which was about regional development, and it also had a number of other programs based on finance, which supported relatively large-scale housing for the poor. So there was some initiative on the part. I knew about this, but it didn't. I didn't connect with it very much when I was studying Kenya in those days. But I did connect, and this gets me to the World Bank, with the Sites and Services Program in the World Bank, which started, we were told actually 2 weeks ago by Michael Cohen, who was standing exactly where I am, that the Sites and Services Program started in 1972. It lasted for about 10 years. And Michael wrote about it in a little booklet, which is often cited. And I forget exactly the name of it, but it was about the apprenticeship of the people in the bank who were facing new and different experiences and had to plan kind of on the run as they found various challenges going forward. These were very, very large projects. The one he cited was in Dakar, the first one, and had 14,000 sites. But I found myself in 1972 actually working on a similar project in Tanzania when I was at when I was in the Ministry of Lands, Housing, and Urban Development. And our project was almost equally large, except it was divided into 2 sites. But nevertheless, there were thousands and thousands of sites, and they were later studied by somebody who's sitting in front of me. But they also, this project took a long time to get off the ground, just as the Dakar one did. And but they were the major kind of spearhead of large-scale infrastructural planning, following the idea of large-scale housing estates, which began to be people began to disassociate themselves with large-scale housing estates beginning in the 1970s, and by the 1980s, hardly any of that existed already. The Sites and Services Program probably had a child, and that child was the so-called squatter upgrading approach, which is now the kind of the best practices approach, and has been championed by the Cities Alliance and by some other agencies. I would like to point out that Habitat started, as all of you know, in 1976, and it gives technical, if not necessarily a lot of project support to a lot of interesting ideas in and around human settlements, including land regularization, including governance now, including urban development. Habitat's important, and it began to collect everything together by the 1980s, along with bilateral agencies who began to get their act together and have individual approaches. I have to say I was not aware during the 1970s and 80s of much that any of the bilateral agencies were doing, with the exception of USAID, but that became, the other agencies became much more significant by the 1990s, and is coalesced in the Cities Alliance, which was started in 1999. Okay. By 2005, it became very clear that there was a serious decline in support for urban development on the part of international agencies. I don't have to show evidence for this. I've heard a lot of people from different agencies speak about it, and in many, many cases, and not just USAID, but many other cases, not all, but many of the other cases, it's a lamentable fact that there's little, if any, support left in the agencies for urban development funding. I could cite the case of my own agency in Canada, which used to have 2 people working on urban and now doesn't really have any. I would be hard-pressed to find projects which have actually taken place in any of the CETA programs from Canada. What are the reasons for this? So I'd like to get to this quickly. One is that there is a weakness in terms of the urban constituencies in the north and south. And this is really a political argument. In my own country, there was an election a year ago, and in that election, the Conservative Party won, but it did not get one seat in any of the three major urban areas in Canada. It didn't get one. So it's not, it's not surprising that when you look at CITA's program right now, there's certainly a consistency between what the Conservative Party is interested in, and that consistency pretty well excludes urban. And that may be true in some other countries as well. It certainly is part of what I would understand, anyway, as one of the reasons behind the decline in interest in urban in the United States. Secondly, there is a persistence of rural bias in what I would call southern political economy. At least in African countries, in place after place, there is an overrepresentation of, at least political representation, of rural, relatively socially homogeneous areas, and an underrepresentation of diverse urban areas in national governments. And there are very sophisticated, elaborate arguments about why that's the case, and the most important book behind this, which explains it, in my opinion, is a book by Mahmoud Mamdani called Citizens and Subjects. And that book explains why rural political economy and urban political economy just don't mix, and why so many national governments basically are elected on the rural political economy side. At the same time, cities are growing bigger. They're a challenge to national governments. They have power economically, but that power can't really be allowed to go too far, because national governments would lose what little sovereignty they have left in an age of globalization. They're very diverse, which makes them very difficult to manage, and they're squabbling and they're very difficult to deal with. So it's the easier, perhaps, part of political valor to either ignore or sideline the needs of cities in developing countries. Now, other issues, and these are I'm just going down some of the reasons which came to mind about why urban funding has declined, is one of them has to do with the overabundance of other issues on the agenda that have come up that have constituencies. Human rights is an immediate candidate for that. Huge international constituency for pushing for human rights and making this an element or even a prerequisite for development. Democratization, making that a prerequisite for development. Then we have the whole panoply of MDGs, as many as there are, and subcategories of those. And this reminded me, and I'll see if I can find it here, of a cartoon, which I don't know if I can get it. I need some assistance here, but I want to show you this cartoon. So, Megan, please. I'm stuck on. Okay, I need to get out of that. How do I do that? Okay.
It's right here.
Okay. So this is a cartoon I saw in the New Yorker, and I couldn't resist. The bottom of it is only her feet, so you haven't missed anything. But anyway, maybe that's not a typical development agency, but it very well could be if you substituted the words. Anyway, it's a complicated world, and we have to make choices, but we can't be immobilized as a result of that. Okay, now what? Okay. I want to get back to the slideshow, which is here, right? Okay, so, and finally, I would say there's the whole question of intra-agency dynamics. New people coming in, people wanting to push their own agendas and, organizational issues which people, I think, are very aware of. Okay, the significance of assistance. How important is this anyway? Or maybe we're just, focusing on something which really isn't important. In aggregate terms, it's not that important. International assistance for urban, if you look at the total amount of urban development there is and try to aggregate it, we know it's only about 4 or 5% of what actually goes on. But it can be very important in individual project terms because they're a beacon and they're kind of an intellectual focus for the planning the positive and constructive planning that can go on. However, what one always hears is, well, if this is a good project, which sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, can't we scale it up? Don't we have to do that? Isn't that a requirement? Don't agencies tend to promote scaling up as a virtually unanalyzed objective? And maybe it is a good objective from the point of view of agency requirements and the economic benefits of aid, but at the same time, scaling things up means that you lose an awful lot of detail. Every time you scale something up from one place to the other, you lose a certain amount of contextual detail. I'm not saying that when scaling up takes place, it doesn't take the context into account. But by the very nature of the exercise, less of the context will be taken into the account than if it had started in that particular place. And the more you do that, the more you lose that whole requirement of successful organizational management. And that requirement, which I learned from John Turner many, many years ago, is that the closer in complexity is the organizational direction of a project to the actual project and local context. The closer that the directive agency is in terms of complexity, the better the project will turn out. And the more we remove ourselves, the more we simplify, the more this argument has been advanced in a different way by James Scott in a very famous book called Seeing Like a State. And that's part of the scaling up. It's both good and it's bad. In terms of ideas and initiatives, there have been a lot of really important initiatives which have been circulating. And here I'm just listing some of them, and I know I'm going to have to rush through this because of time. So I'm mentioning the fact that agencies have in many ways supported informal sector people in poor areas, almost against the political will of many of the countries in which they live. And I think from the point of view of equity, that's a good thing. There are lots of examples of that. There has been very good support for infrastructural-based urban development. When cities need to be competitive, they need to clean up their transport programs, their infrastructural programs, etc., and they've received a lot of very good aid from USAID, World Bank, and at a smaller scale, Cities Alliance. And maybe sustainable development wouldn't have happened in many cities, or it wouldn't have been an initiative, Curitiba notwithstanding, because it did happen there independent of the outside. But it has happened in other cities because it's been supported from the outside. Support for decentralization, these are all good. These are all on the positive side. These ideas which circulate around the world, and I would say that we're all everybody probably in this room who's come to the meeting, Susan, me, Mohamed, whoever is here, we're part of this kind of vaguely constructed epistemic community of international urban scholars and practitioners, and we have a sense of what's important and what's good, and we are helping to support, I would say, collectively, local solutions in the face of intensive capital development, which might actually do a lot of damage to some cities if allowed to go unchecked. This is an argument I actually heard from somebody in the World Bank. Finally, the international community does give support to beleaguered urban politicians and officials who may need to have a longer-term project, need to have support for a longer-term project, a project which isn't supported within the political confines of the 3-year mandate, the 4-year mandate, etc., for which they are elected. What should happen now? What are the next possible stages of urban assistance? Let me just go over this is kind of my wish list. There should be a lot more South-South cooperation, although it is starting to happen, as you can see by my examples. Cities Alliance, again, PDM in West Africa with Afro-Cities conferences, possibly other similar conferences elsewhere in the world, and they're localized in other regional activities of the UMP. The weakening of the North, and this is a very important point, as a point of reference, and a better understanding of localized solutions. What happens in the South does not have to be referred to the North. It doesn't have to be referenced by northern examples or iconic examples in the North. It can be genuinely made in the South and probably should be if it's going to have any traction. I believe there should be more emphasis on policy and governance and less emphasis on formalized regulatory planning. That should be part of the future policies. There should be a lot better coordination among donors, which tends not to be the case. And we can cite chapter and verse from almost any country that we've worked in or we know. And going to different donors, you find a very different story about what they're trying to do in the urban field, and there's very little coordination, and this makes life crazy for recipients in either planning ministries or individual cities. That something has to be done about that, and somebody should take the initiative. More acceptance of distinct approaches for different countries, and as Michael Cohen said last time, a longer-term thematic foci, looking at success or failure in a much longer term than, let's say, the 5-year project cycle, and thinking in terms of outcomes rather than measurable outputs. And finally, and this is me as a political scientist talking, it looks to me like cities are becoming more important politically because of democratization, because of decentralization, because of these civil society forces all over the world. Cities are becoming more important, and they're electing their officials, and the officials are forming international associations, and those international associations and locally elected people are probably going to have more influence over policy, and I think that's a good thing. So I hope that the confluence of factors, political factors at the local level, and some lessons we've now learned from the first, let's say, 35 years of international assistance will make some difference in the next 35 years. Thank you.
Okay, Sue, your next one.
I know there's a presentation on here because somebody put it on, and I have no idea where they put it on. Oh, there you go. Thanks so much, and Blair, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. Enormous privilege to speak. One of the things that Richard and I have in common is that we have studied Africa's urban past. And it may help you explain some of the kinds of resonances between what he has to say and some of what I have to say, because there's that sense that one day, Judgment Day, will look at us as we have looked at others. But the way that we speak and where we speak from is really quite different. And you've had a look at my bio, but just so that you know where I'm coming from, it may be useful just to know a little bit more about who I am. I'm an academic. But what's probably important is that I work and have worked for almost all of the major donors. Pick a donor, I've done some work, which is different from when you work for a donor. So you have some different kind of perspective. Plus I live in Cape Town and have lived in Johannesburg. And it's very much from there that I want to make a series of remarks about today. And it's a subject on which I feel quite passionately, and really it's about the morality, in a sense, on the grand scale of ignoring the urban question. And what I want to do is to make a case for why we should be taking that so much more seriously. And you would expect, I'm sure today, somebody's going to show us a slide of how the fact is that 2007 marks the moment, supposedly, even though we know the figures are dreadful, of majority urban dominance. And the bottom line, in a sense, for me, is that as a donor community that has signed up to the Millennium Development Goals, you haven't got a hope of meeting them if you don't get a specific focus on cities, if that's where the majority of the world's population are in fact living. But I think there are more significant arguments, more substantive arguments than that for us focusing. And like Richard, this is a little bit of stream of consciousness which I'm really looking forward to fleshing out. And I think that there are a number of reasons why we are in the state that we're in. And it's not that nobody's working in cities. Of course they are. Just told you, I work in cities. Everybody works in cities for donors. But that there's this lack of ability to grasp the urban, to talk about the city, to bring this stuff together. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. Almost everybody who works for a donor was trained in an northern institution and was brought up on bread and butter of urban literature that came from cities of the north. And that stuff's really not really helpful in terms of understanding what's going on in cities of the south. Not that they're completely different kinds of places. And in fact, one might argue if you live in Los Angeles, you really want to have an idea of what's going on in Mexico City or in Sao Paulo if you want to understand your urban future. But the urban literature at the moment is really particularly unhelpful in looking at issues like informality, at looking at questions of a weak state, for example. Similarly, most of the literature on development is really weak in understanding the urban and continues to be dominated by rural issues and by that host of issues that Richard, in fact, talked about. Richard also spoke about home and host country opposition, and a T if you'd like to hear my very own personal stories from South Africa, a place where you would expect a degree of support for the urban, seeing as we are a well and truly majority urban country. Not so. We can tell you about the failed attempts to get through a national urban strategy or to get it updated. We might argue that there continues to be an assumption that poverty is rural, not urban. Now, everybody who's read any of the literature knows that that's not the case. The urbanization of poverty is real. The numbers of people concentrated in cities who are poor, exceeding the number of poor people living in rural areas. So even if the depth of poverty is not as great as it is in some small rural communities, this is where the face of poverty is. The face of poverty is no longer a rural woman sitting under a tree with children. The face of poverty is a ghetto with trash of a whole lot of people who are HIV infected. Okay, that's the reality of the face of poverty. So it's a myth that poverty is rural. I think there's quite often an assumption made both, or pretty much everywhere, is that cities are big and that they can look after themselves. The fact that wealth and capacity is concentrated in cities leads to this assumption. When you first arrive, you meet an extraordinary number of really competent, talented people. Why can't they look after their own problems? Okay, why does the donor community need to be there? Maybe there are more sinister kinds of assumptions that get made. Cities like Kuala Lumpur are really not part of the global economy, and if they are, maybe we don't want them to be. Beijing, come the anti-Chinese discourse that I've seen on international global television at the moment. The sorts of assumptions, though, in a world which is increasingly made up of cities as the important nodes in a global economy, why is it that we're making the assumption that the large cities of the South are not part and parcel of that? So I think there are a number of different reasons that are there. I suspect, in truth, the real reason is one of ignorance. We don't know where to start. Okay, these are terribly big, terribly complicated, complex kinds of problems, and it's very difficult to find enough expertise out there on how to begin to start addressing in a systematic, donor-driven, programmatic kind of way, what is it, what are the appropriate entry points that one should be doing. We can talk about fashion, the fact that urban planning has gone out of fashion. I happen to disagree with Richard, but we can pick up on that later about how important that is. And as I say, this really underlying thing, that one of the reasons for the malaise on the urban is just that it's very, very hard to do. Okay? So whatever the reasons, and I'm not suggesting a hierarchy here in any kind of way, I think there are a number of reasons for understanding why it is. Plus the fact that in a donor community, within those organizations, you don't already have people with an urban hat out there to protect their turf. And so when the new budget comes and the new budget cuts come, people are not necessarily positioning for power in particular kinds of ways. What I want to argue, though, is that even when donors are doing a lot in cities, that's not good enough. Okay? And in other words, what I'm saying is that there is something about understanding the complexity of the urban, understanding how water relates to housing, relates to transport in an urban context, that we need to be able to, if not program around, to at least have some understanding of and some response to that complexity. And so we need to be able to get that big picture. And the big picture in global terms is that cities are the future. Cities are here, they're now, and that map of Africa going to change very, very dramatically over the next 20 years. And so the global reality, one that increasingly is important. And the argument which is implicit in my presentation to you is that cities are absolutely key to developing a delivery on the donor agenda. The Millennium Development Goals are the obvious example. But I want to suggest to you that there are some things which are apparently central to donor constituencies that have fundamentally different outworkings when considered in spatial terms, okay, and particularly when you look at the urban scale. Climate change, the darling of the moment. I'm an urban geographer. I work on climate change. The issues of mitigation and adaptation are fundamentally different. You only have to read through some of the material from New Orleans, compound that and think of what that would mean if we'd had that in Lagos. Cities are different, very, very different. Food security. Urban agriculture is not going to solve the problems of cities with 10 and 20 million people. Issues of urban food security are fundamentally different from those of rural food security. Not so in the donor agenda. Similarly, what makes you think, there's a big piece in today's Washington Post about biodiversity and the protection of alien species, really crucial in terms of some of the questions of ecological resource use and the protection of biodiversity. But what makes you think that a state that can't give water to its people is going to be able to police whether alien seeds are going in and out of its borders? Yeah? There's something about a city and the use of resources and the use of that consumption, particularly as many of the cities which have concentrations of poverty also have concentrations of wealth. I come from Joburg. I don't know if you've ever been to Johannesburg, but it's not unlike a lot of cities in the so-called global south. It's characterized by abject poverty and absolutely ostentatious wealth. Now, how are you going to stop the consumption patterns emerging, which are characterized by this part of the world in those parts of the world, if you don't have significant and sustained kinds of governance? And similarly, questions of the burden of disease, particularly when you start to talk about the kind of lifestyle diseases of obesity. Security, one of the other darlings of the donor agenda. The issues of urban security, fundamentally different, and this project has worked extensively on that question. I seem to have got food security on the brain in that there. And basically what I'm trying to make, the point I'm making, and we could have used other examples, is that there are a number of issues where a sectoral approach, even though that's how your organization may be structured, is necessary but not sufficient to addressing the real development imperative. And I want to give you a couple of what for me are the equivalent of some of Richard's areas of concern and priority in the working through of the question of the donor agenda. The first one is one around urban finance. And as cities become really large, and as they house a proportionately greater percentage of the population, you can't have a situation, as we have had so long, where national governments bail out cities when they get into trouble. Okay? It just doesn't work, unless you live in this part of the world and you are in New York or a number of other places. But basically, there's an end to the credit thing. And you can't expect countries to grow if you don't have a sound fiscal base for these very large, very complex cities. And I think that that means that what we've got to focus on is making urban revenue generation a fundamental component. And that means focusing on the question of a rate space. What do I mean by that? Poor people don't pay rates. They can't, nor should they. Okay? But you can't have a city that is able to deliver on a service infrastructure if it doesn't have a sustainable revenue base. That means you've got to be putting in place medium-term, long-term strategies for full employment, for planning, for land use management that will enable you to get together sufficient resources within a city context to address and deal with those very high, very large levels of poverty. And so city-scale mechanisms for redistribution are absolutely fundamental to poverty reduction. But you can't do that if your city hasn't even got the capacity to get an address, to deliver a recipient. To use the James Scott reference again, a city you can be seen, if you can't be seen by the state, you can't be a recipient of any of the state's resources and you can't be a beneficiary of the state. And at an urban scale, we need to start asking what that means, not just at a national scale. An identity document is quite simple relative to household services and other kinds of questions. It means tackling the question of informality and on systemic problems of urban management. The other absolutely fundamental reason, and it gets left off time and time again, of the donor agenda is the question of urban politics. I don't know why, because you get a discourse about good governance, you get a discourse about anti-corruption, you get a discourse of all of those things, but ask any politician why they're going to local government, not national government, because that's where the money is spent. And if that's where the money is spent, that's where the corruption and the patronage and the nepotism, etc. are. You can't begin to get to grips with the good governance agenda until such time as you engage the city. For me, a much more critical area is the absence of engagement with civil society. And here I think that the literature on livelihoods has actually done us a major disservice. And that on participation to some extent too. How do you engage 5, 10, 15 million people? Yeah? How do you? You can't go and talk to everybody. So what are you doing and why? Those kinds of questions are absolutely critical. Fundamental to that is having highly sophisticated NGOs, most of whom are not receiving donor funding at the moment, who need to be able to engage at that technical level with city politics, and that means capacity, capacity, capacity. Richard's already mentioned the anti-urban question, and we know in part that some of the reason for that is that cities are generally sites of opposition. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons for opposition to that. I want to suggest, and I'm moving to a close, Blair, so don't worry, that there are two other things that I think are fundamental to us rethinking the donor agenda with respect to cities. If you're following some of the academic debates, you'll see that the notion of a developmental state is back in fashion, fundamentally coming to the fore as people move away from that kind of micro-level household and livelihood kinds of analysis, not rejecting it, but beginning to suggest that some of the things that I've already talked about, you can't have a disaster mitigation strategy based on livelihood assessments. The state has to do something. The state has a role. There are some things that only states can do. Transport systems are being very obvious kinds of examples of land use planning systems, other kinds of examples. So beginnings of a shift back to the notion of a developmental state, and particularly in the part of the world that I come from, a very important debate. But fundamental to the notion of a developmental state, and part of why that's gained ground, has been the idea that it accepts as a reality the fact that you have to have a growth agenda. In other words, that poverty reduction is tied to an expanding economy. Extremely difficult to engage in poverty reduction if you don't have a growing agenda. And under those conditions, what you would expect is that cities would be contributing more to the national fiscus than anywhere else in the country. But the question we then have to ask, if we're serious about implementing that agenda, is how do you make those cities grow and grow fast? Okay, so that economic question, absolutely crucial. But I think it's important that we don't see the role of cities as beginning and ending with growth. Fundamental to the donor agenda is the notion of addressing the conditions of poverty. And the developmental state for me means very different things at the urban scale. it's not just about the rollout of a general social safety net. It's about the rollout of protection of things at the urban scale. And what do I mean by that? I mean some kind of redistribution. We know cities are sites of great inequality. So some form of capacity at the city scale to effect redistribution. Some notion of universal service provision, not just rolling out the taps, but putting affordable water into the taps of the poor. Having the systems to be able to ensure that there is affordable water in the systems of the poor. That doesn't mean forgetting about half of the population, as we so often do in the Indian context, and leaving those to the water lords, but about the state having some of that kind of capacity. So the question of rights particularly exercised beyond just the individual, but also at the household, the neighborhood, the city scale, when you begin to start thinking about the sorts of things that you assume, even here in Washington, are your rights, what does that mean if you're sitting in Kinshasa? And finally, it means we need to shift our headspace on what we expect of donors in terms of capacity building. I'd like to suggest that we don't have enough capacity even if we pooled all of the necessary specialists on either the north or the south. We've got to build local capacity. We also have to build a whole new canon, a whole new set of informants, a whole new set of material on what we need, preferably ones who can learn to spell. Effectively, one of the things that I'm suggesting then is that we need to be putting donor money into R&D. We've got a gap. We don't know what to do. The literature is not helpful. Where's the money going into R&D? That's what anybody who's out there looking at a major market of the kind that we're talking about for the donor community. Our market is cities. We've got no information on it. We have no knowledge of what kinds of products we should be putting out there. What are we doing about it? We're going back into our ghettos and focusing on sectors instead of beginning to understand how some of these things come together. And in conclusion, I want to go back to that point about history and to say, think about it. 10, 15, 20, 100 years' time, what are they going to say about people who in 2007, the year in which we declared the world to be urban, were seen to be on the retreat from an urban agenda at the very moment that the urbanization of poverty is its probably most dominant characteristic? Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our speakers. We're now more or less back on schedule. We have 10 or 15 minutes for specific questions or comments to be addressed to Richard and or to Sue. Then we'll move on to the next panel. And for those of you who maybe didn't catch the introduction, we're going to have a general discussion closer to the end. So are there any questions, comments, observations, angry denunciations for the speakers on the panel here? Okay, I see a hand right down here. Please identify yourself.
Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. The two questions are for Susan. What do you mean city-based globalization? And does the globalization cause the rural poor as well as urban poor? And when you talk about the urban revenue and city distribution, seems that these two actually are the one or tied really together.
Why don't you go ahead and respond?
Thanks. What I mean by city-based globalization is, I don't know if you've ever had a look at the points which are deemed to be major nodes and the roots and connections of globalization. Sometimes people talk about the shadow of globalization, those places that are excluded from it. But places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Beijing, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo have all made it in many people's imagination onto the global map. Why? Because they are global staging points of capitalism. They have enough airlines, they have enough finance industry, they are connected kinds of places. You will find headquarters there, you will find all of those, you'll find major ports, you can get anything there that you could get anywhere else. They're the places from which people enter into the global economy. And the idea in the urban literature is basically that those cities have become more and more important under conditions of globalization. Your national status is less important and your city status is more important. It's the same idea that Europe uses to argue that it is a city of city region. It is a region of city regions. Okay, so the conurbations around Frankfurt, for example, will enable it to compete. The conurbations around Amsterdam. Amsterdam's a small city, but its linkages into the global economy are really important. And so it's the basis on which the Cities Alliance has pushed some of the city development strategy stuff to enable cities in poor countries to position themselves globally. That doesn't mean that only the urban population enter the global economy, but that's the portal, if you like, through which globalization is funneled, both in and out. And the problem with not having a portal is it's great news in the sense that you're not subjected as much to the ravages of globalization, but you also don't get any of the benefits. And some of the argument is that if a city is big enough, it automatically, or it has a big enough hinterland, it automatically becomes part of that global system. And certainly some of the populations that we're beginning to see in parts of the global south suggest that that's absolutely the case. So the Brazilian example is a good one. So is the much of the South Asian stuff. Jakarta would be a really good example of that. So that's what's meant by the globalization and where cities are more and more important. And for a poor country, your city, so let's take my example of South Africa. For South Africa, the Greater Johannesburg region, the future of the Greater Johannesburg region is absolutely key. Yet when you go into every national policy debate, what you discover is that whether it's the fiscal flows or the policy discourse or the poverty strategies, they all suggest that poverty is rural. They all suggest that it's much more important to be getting the hinterland working than it is to be getting the city working. That makes no sense. Particularly makes no sense if you've got an economy and a government policy which says we've got to have a growth agenda. They're beginning to realize that, and so we've got a kind of a Janus face, a schizophrenia, where, you know, two different kinds of things happen. And that's very, very typical. And even at a smaller scale, that is typical. So that's the first question. And then to your point about the question of urban revenue and urban expenditure, absolutely. I'm always astonished how the fiscal and the finance people, and I'm sure there are some of them in the room, so I'm hesitant to speak on this. But the underlying, if I think again, let me take my own country as an example. Post 1994, South Africa, there's been a fantastic emphasis on collecting greater revenue at a national scale. The rollout of the tax collection system has been fantastically efficient, really, really good, very impressive at a national scale. At a local scale, at a city scale, attention to what would generate revenue is not even on the political agenda. Okay? What do I mean by that? We have rolled out neighborhoods that have not got a hope of ever becoming, not in 100 years, not in 200 years, are never going to be the kinds of places that you would want to put somebody who's going to pay rates. Only people who are there because they have no choice are going to be there. So the notion that you're building a city that has to have, not today, not next week, but in 20 and 30 and 40 years' time, a revenue stream from the kinds of places that you're rolling out isn't part of our consciousness. We've got very short-termers. It ties into Richard's point about needing a much longer understanding of what makes for success. Giving a person a house is no use if that house is going to decline over 20 years. You're going to have to build them another one at the other end of it. You've got to build them the kind of house that they're going to want to invest in, that other people are going to want to invest in. And that's not the De Soto argument. I'm not making the De Soto argument. What I'm saying here, though, is that there's a set of investments in public spaces, in public investment, in qualities of neighborhoods, in the kinds of social facilities, schools, healthcare systems, security, street lighting, the sort of stuff that we don't put money into because it doesn't fit into those boxes that sit in the donor community, because we've got a housing department. We've got a rights department. We don't have anybody who looks after picking up litter on the street and planting trees.
Okay, let me see if there are any other questions, and then I'm going to give... Why don't we collect both questions, and we'll give Richard a chance to comment, even if none of the questions are for Richard. So we'll go to the back, and then we'll go right down here.
Thank you. This is for Susan. Very interesting presentation. I'm Vic Barbiero. I'm part of the Wilson Center, but also George Washington University. Maybe I missed it in the introductory comments. Are there any lessons from China that we can take, either good or bad, and apply in other places? Because it seems to me what's happening in China with industrialization and urbanization, there are some very frightening things happening, but potentially very interesting ones regarding revenue generation, et cetera. That's one. And then the second one, I used to work for a donor agency in the past as well, and whenever people ask for money, they have to say, well, what are the indicators of success? And I was wondering, when I used to work at USAID, in a 5-year horizon, you have to tell your mission director, what am I going to get for 5 years in terms of investing in the urban environment? What kind of indicators, key indicators, would you suggest? And actually both, I'd like to hear from both Richard and Susan.
I think Richard will have a response too. And we'll come right down here. Megan, yeah.
Thank you. Dave Liebson, a variety of hats, but also including the International Housing Coalition, which advocates for housing as part of the development agenda. For both of you mentioned sort of the politics of urban and people being elected from rural areas, or at least with rural interests. Do either of you see any early indications as the world becomes more urban of any shift in that, any change in that? I guess my assumption would be it will eventually change, but do you see any signs of change on a time scale that would be useful to get ahead of the curve?
Okay, Richard, do you want to go first, and then we'll give Sue the last word before the break.
Okay. The question about people having a short time scale, I think it's very important for everything we do, and international indicators are increasingly important, actually, both for agencies and, Habitat is setting up more and more studies of indicators, and we have observatories being set up in different cities, different countries. So more and more the emphasis on making policy goes back to indicators which allow one to compare, because we can't make policy for one place unless we can compare it with something else which has worked in an approximately similar situation, or with the appropriate logical conditions. So because of comparison, because of making policy, we need indicators. It's very hard to do institutional comparisons over 5 years, because how do you say you have good governance or you don't have good governance in a 5-year time span? But you can do physical output comparisons, and you can certainly do demographic things. And so the emphasis on what's happening tends to focus on the indicators one can measure, rather than the ones which are more subjective and perhaps looser, but at the same time that may be more important. And I just want to bridge. I don't really know specifically how one would do that, but I think when one looks at indicators, one has to think about what is really happening, and why are these cities they're becoming more complex. Can we always measure them using the simplest indicators, or do we have to look at more subjective ones? And I think there are some studies of this, and there certainly is the World Barometer, I think, which looks at subjective ideas, but mostly having to do with the climate for investment and for corruption and things like that. But these are subjective things, although we need to have more indicators having to do with governance, and I'm not the one who necessarily has to worry about that. One of the people who does is in this audience. On the question, is there going to be a shift, or can there be a shift? Representation always happens a lot more slowly. This is what I think we've learned over the years. As social groups change in a constituency, the representation of those social groups within the institutionalized political system changes much more slowly. So it will probably happen in 15 or 20 years that people will come to the fore who have urban constituencies and who don't depend on rural constituencies. And you can see it. I mean, Kenya is an example of this. There's a guy named Raila Odinga, whose father was a rural politician. And that guy, Raila Odinga, who is an important opponent to the current president of Kenya, has a very urban constituency and represents it a lot. He's become, and the same is true of the opposition person in Zimbabwe, though, he's in big trouble most of the time with Mugabe. But nevertheless, you can see these politicians coming to the fore already. They're in difficulties because the existing regime is much more oriented toward these more permanent and homogeneous communities in the rural areas. But it is happening, and it will continue to happen. And I would say within 15 or 20 years, you will get more sensitivity to the urban fact in so many countries in the South, which isn't necessarily to say that it's going to happen in our own countries up here. Thanks.
Sue?
Thanks. Very interesting questions. On China, I wish I knew enough to be able to answer, and I'm hoping there may be some people in the room who do later on. But for me, there's a bigger question to what you're saying, which is partly around the fact that we don't learn from places that don't express themselves in English very well. So I suspect that just as much as there are lessons from China, there are lessons from Latin America, which don't get brought into the policy discourse. And similarly, that there are places which are middle income that tend to be written off by donors with their focus on poor countries, where some of the most interesting innovations are probably taking place, and certainly the most interesting homegrown innovations are taking place. I like the Chinese example as an interesting space because I think it's been a very different developmental route, and the state is that much stronger, and so it's certainly worth interrogating. So a really interesting question. On indicators, I have as much concern about the questions that we ask as the indicators that we are able to present, particularly given the paucity of the data, and particularly the data at the city scale. You can generally get neighborhood data and you can get national data, but you try and get city scale data. It's a nightmare. So we're all looking at poor old Mohamed, who will have to talk later. But for me, that's already... But if one has an indicator, the indicator for me is always very simple. If it was your child who was going to live in that neighborhood, would it be a good or a bad thing? When you think about it over those kinds of time scales. On the question of the shift, I think for me there certainly is evidence of tension. This is not it's not a simple discussion, and I'd absolutely agree with everything that Richard said. But I do have to give you one anecdote, which for me is also interesting, is that we have to be very careful of the words. Khayelitsha is a very dense, very poor township outside, which is the bulk of Cape Town's population. And habitually, councillors will speak of themselves as rural. It is the densest, the most urban part of the city of Cape Town. So I think sometimes when people talk about rural, they have a discourse which is expressing that what they mean is poor. Okay, what they mean is marginalized, which is outside of that traditional economy. So I think we need to be careful. But from a donor perspective, and I want to go back to the big point that Richard was making, is the really important point is that typically the people who push the urban agenda first are those who are concerned with growth. And the problem with the donors' buyout from the urban agenda is that what it fails to do is to give the counter-argument about why cities are absolutely fundamental for development and for poverty reduction. And it's in that space that it seems to me that there's a lot of room for an influencing agenda in very particular kinds of ways. But we've got to be clever and smart about it. You can't do it. It's not as easy to be as emotive about it as it is. And that's why I think we need to go back to basics in thinking what is there.
Well, we're going to take a brief 15-minute coffee break and come back and shift focus and hear from some folks from inside donor agencies from the World Bank and USAID. So we'll gather again in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. That was good. Oh, it was fun listening to ourselves anyway.
Hi.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
That's not a lot of fun. Yeah,
It was a lot worse yesterday. I actually had to go to a massage therapist. What's today? Monday. Actually, I went on Saturday, so I was coffee. Are you going to sit down here?
Yeah, we're gonna switch.
How are you doing, sir? Oh, yeah.
I've been reading.
Oh, I bought the book that you said.
The cover is so great. I was reading it on the plane. There's nothing you don't know. I'm just telling you how come when you say there's a command curve, you don't really know that. You think there's a command curve, but you don't really know how it's or there's a cost curve. So all of that.
How are you?
You don't
Fine, how are you?
Good.
You think you do, and so therefore you fail, and then by failing, then you learn what to do. You know, okay? You may not be surprised at what he says.
And also, since there's a big book there, is
Hi, I'm Olga Kaganova. Nice to meet you. Two questions. First of all, is it possible to have a copy of your presentation?
Sure, the only thing is it's just an outline.
Yeah, but still, and I have a specific. Let me give you.
Computer, if you do, I can give you
I have my card. If you can email it or tell me how
The other
else I
glasses
could
look
find
fine.
it.
Just be sure.
Also, the specific question. You mentioned a very interesting idea, which it would be interesting to know what. Yeah.
We'll have a discussion. Yeah, I see you have like a half.
You had an item there that it should be more attention to policy and governance versus
Right, she doesn't agree with
formalized. No, I agree with this, but it's interesting
we have
for
to-
me. I work in technical
Right,
assistance.
okay, right.
It's interesting what you imply.
Because I think it's a broader conception. I think planning is part of governance, but I think if you focus on maybe it's a different way of saying what she's saying, but there's more and more thinking about what governance is. And governance is putting everything together rather than planning. It's just focusing on a very technical solution.
Yeah, and from what I see from my ground level technical assistance, what I see as a drama that very often technical assistance
Yes.
comes and suggests, oh, let's codify law. What? It's wrong. Have a policy first, have governance strategy, and just
Well,
after
also,
experiment.
By having a governance strategy, then you bring in the governed.
Yeah.
The governed are part of codifying the law and all that other stuff. It's just a way of thinking about it. It isn't. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have planning. I'm just saying that it's more important to focus on the larger issue, which ultimately is where it has to end up. It has to end up in governance. It has to be there because we even see that our own planners are much more sensitive to what the mayor wants, what the politicians are willing to go with. I mean, this is part of how the system works much more broadly.
Yeah, but also, what do you think? Does it have an implication that policy governance and small-scale experimentation should come first before you do these
maybe
grand
it should.
plans?
Maybe,
Because
yeah.
sometimes plans are built without real
Yes.
good
The only thing is,
experimentation.
yes, experimentation, it does happen, but it doesn't happen enough by donors. They don't usually have pilot projects. They usually start by having a big project because they can't waste their time. And they usually have some assumptions about what will work because they've done it in another place. They go, I mean, there's a whole process.
Well, this is a bad example. I think that they're learning now. They do pilot projects, but yeah, it's
I
just
don't know.
bad
Not the
implementation
ones
by
I-
somebody
I see. Okay.
Ukraine to Central Asia.
Oh, I see,
and really
okay.
said, oh,
Yeah, you can learn from another place, that's right. But you don't spend enough time working with local people to develop some local variant and then see whether it works very well. Well, that's also the matter of time.
Yeah,
How much
yeah,
time are you
yeah.
willing to spend on something? Anyway,
Thanks.
okay. Hi. Hey, you shaved.
Yeah, I shaved.
I was
Not
just,
the hair yet.
you didn't come from mine. Mine was the first.
See, I thought yours was gonna be the ending one. That's why.
That's what I thought, but then everything got shifted around. It's okay, I can give you my PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Did you hear Sue though? Maybe
Yeah,
you
yeah.
heard her before. She's good.
Yeah.
Mine was a little more general.
Because I
I
tried
haven't
calling you in the morning
Oh.
to figure out exactly when your presentation was, but I think the phone was off.
Oh, in my room? It wasn't even working. Oh. Or maybe I wasn't there because I left at 7:20 and I didn't go back to my room. So it wasn't. Just I was having breakfast and I came here. But anyway, I can give you the PowerPoint if you want it.
And then
Anyway, so what's
I read that paper that you gave me in Barjo
okay? Which one is that?
on urban politics.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's interesting that in India actually there's really not much going on in that field here in terms of research and
Yeah.
stuff.
No, there isn't much.
I mean, you'd think there would be.
I mean, she even talks about politics too. She even made that argument. Her thing was, I didn't show her that paper. It was independent. But I was working on that paper for 3 weeks.
They need challenge, so it's a good place to challenge.
And also, you mean the globalization is create more the rural and not many. No, I mean in general, people always think cost the rural food, but not thinking about why is cost rural? Because
Okay. You had a busy weekend.
Me? Yeah. What was I doing? Just running after my kids.
Oh, okay.
Hi, my name's Jessica.
I'm Mila.
Nice to meet you.
I think if we can get a couple more people in the room, we'll then get started. I apologize for this room being so cold. It's always been cold ever since the building opened. And despite 6 years now of GSA assuring us they were going to fix the problem, they never do. So
It keeps you on your toes.
it does. It keeps you awake. Well, not in this, not in the Ronald Reagan building. It's not. So. Okay, I think we have a quorum. I have a couple of important announcements. You'll notice that there's a lunch break at 11:45. That is open for everyone who's attending. So if you don't have lunch plans, you don't need to have lunch plans because we will give you a free lunch. The other part of the announcement, which is also intended to try to keep you here, is we have two incredibly dynamic speakers in the afternoon. So after you have the lunch, you'll be kept awake not only by the cold air conditioning, but also by the stimulating speakers. But we have two really interesting and excellent speakers right now. So I'm going to turn the floor over. As I said in the beginning, everybody has their biographies, so I'm not going to go through the biographies. Also, some of you have been asking, there were books that were outside that were all scoffed up, or we just put a new supply out, so there will be more books outside. But I think what I'm simply going to do is turn the floor over to Mila.
50 minutes? Good morning. I want to thank Richard Stren and the foundation and the center for inviting me to be here today. It's a great pleasure. I prepared a presentation last week, and I have to confess that after the speech of the two speakers before me, I'm completely humiliated because my presentation is so dull that I really would like to replace it. But since I have to keep it, so I'm going to make an introduction about what really I think is important, what I took from the first two speakers, go very briefly about my presentation, and just zero in the conclusions, which really I'd like to share with you my own thoughts. I work for the World Bank. I've been working for the World Bank for many years, and in the last 10 years I've been working in urban development. I'm now the senior advisor for urban policies in the World Bank. So I'm supposed to know about urban, and I'm supposed to be able to influence urban decisions in the World Bank. I'm an enormous fan of Richard Stren and everything that he has done in his career, and he has been my mentor and my ally in the fight of putting urban in the map. And I was extremely surprised and very warmed by how candid and how passionate both Susan and Richard mentioned about how important is urban and how little attention we are doing it. And I am subscribing 3,000% what they said. In our constant fight in the World Bank for putting urban agendas in the table is a continuous struggle. We are winning the battle, but slowly, and sometimes it's very hard really to get discouraged. As you know, as they have mentioned, this year is the year of the urban population. Cities are growing. All of us in the room, we know how important are cities. But if we open randomly any report of the World Bank written in the last 10 years, many times the word urban is not in the report. Certainly the word rural is going to be there. And our brain capacity, and you have a very big institution with enormous resource power in terms of brain, in terms of intellectual capacity, But as you know, it was mentioned before, we have dominated by 30 years of excellent, excellent rural economics and agricultural economics people. So this is a legacy that really could give us, the courage, because if they did it for agriculture, why not for urban? But it's a legacy. And our colleagues that see the rural and agriculture as really the hub of the world, where really the agricultural revolution happened, where really hunger, was solved. You have this fantastic thing called the Consultative Group for Rural Agricultural Research. It was really the solution for the catastrophic starvation that we had predicted. You probably remember in the 60s, everyone thought that India was going to starve. It didn't starve. We have really an agricultural revolution. And these people that produced these fantastic achievements for humanity, they really keep to their hearts how good they are intellectual. So when you speak about urban, and when you speak about slums, you speak about poverty, and the students said the importance of the city to solve poverty and solve growth, this is not going easy. With all the rigors of the world, my colleagues from the other side of the table saying slums in cities are just policy failures of rural policies. So if you say, no, but you need to look at them because the slums are there. So the slums are there because you did not take care of your rural sector, because you did not take care of your small cities. So it's not. So if you are going to invest more on cities, you are just going to. So it's a circle vicious that really, until, as Susan mentioned, until there is a very honest and a very committed understanding that really cities and growth and poverty alleviation are one of the same triangle, we are not going to win the battle. And obviously that, when you speak with CIDA, the Canadian CIDA, the Swedish CIDA, the defeats of the world, the USAID, the urban people say, what went wrong? No, as Susan and Richard said, today is probably the day where we should all go, about helping cities. But so I just want to say that thank you so much for putting this at the table and in such a passionate terms, because I believe that there is out there a community that is ready to, really pushing the analytical. And I think if we are going to make it, as Susan said, is on the knowledge, on the analytics, on putting the facts in the table, and so that cities are going to grow, not because it's just a trend that no one can stop, but because they really have a contribution to make. And the good news is that the World Bank this year is going to be, there's a World Development Report, which is our main flagship. Last year was on agriculture. And really the message that these people are producing is that agriculture is the solution for everything in the world. So be aware, like in 1 month, you'll have in all papers, the World Bank says agriculture is the solution of the world. And then, fortunately, we won a little battle now. And the next WBR for 09 will be in geography. And in geography, I believe that, concentration, agglomeration, cities, really, we are going to make a little bit indentation, saying that, urban is a very important, so it's both technological, both agglomeration economies, and both poverty alleviation. So just to let you know where I stand, and that I believe that the future is on our side. Let me just go very, very quickly about my presentation. And this is an outline of what I would like to say. And one thing that I would like to just to share with you, I'm sure that in previous presentations you already went through this, but one of the things that we in the bank we have been trying to do, it was about to put straight some of the numbers. And so we know that urban poverty is on the rise, that at present 1/3 of the urban residents are poor, and somehow there is substantial improvement in the knowledge of the numbers and the incidence of poverty. So I'm just very quickly going to tell you, obviously there is definitions about how you measure urban poverty, and to make things short, we had a very recent work done by Raquel and some of other economists in the bank who really measure in a very fine detail what does it mean to be poor in urban areas, so they adjust the purchasing price, and they did some kind of basket, commodity basket, and so covering 95% of the population in developing countries, and they did define two marks. What is the incidence of poverty for people living below $1 a day and $2 a day. The $2 a day, we call it poverty, and $1 a day extreme poverty. The result is that 750 million people in urban areas are below the poverty line, and 29 million are below $1 a day, 34%. So this is how the urban poor are distributed. You see that sub-Saharan Africa and South Asian regions are really the ones that have larger incidence, and these we would expect with the big continents like India and China having enormous and here in terms of percentual terms would be the same. So the largest one is about the percentage of poor people, and in the blue one will be the percentage of very poor, the extreme poor urban. So in terms of trends, the study covered the last 10 years from 1993 to 2002, and what shows is that really, and unfortunately, the evolution is not very optimistic. In terms, of incidence of people living in extreme poverty, there is no change. Where in the last 10 years there is not really much improvement, and however, for the $2 a day, there has been a little bit of an improvement, and the rates they declined by 2.3%. Is it a little bit depressing? Yes, but if you really take into account that this was accompanied by enormous migration of people from the rural areas to the urban areas, this should be somehow expected. We are really in enormous transition, and we have an explosion of the population in the urban areas. We believe that this is also bringing the urbanization of the poverty. So. But then again, the numbers are here, and one interesting data is that the overall poverty rate for the world as a whole is estimated to have fallen by 8% between 1993 and 2002, and this the reason why this improvement, especially, is coming from the rural poverty side. So you have really improvement in rural poverty side, which is really much higher than the improvement in the urban poverty. So the evolution is clear. And the share of the urban poor has increased in all regions, and now in Latin America we have 65%, and in Europe and Central Asia 50%. So the world is urbanizing, and these are the issues that we in general we look at it, and I'm sure that in the past seminars you have already mentioned some of those. We tend to see that urban poverty, there is all a part of services, but also the whole part of capacity of making a living, capacity to make earnings. And this is really the most important and the most difficult part, for us. We identify that is low skills, the fact of informality. Most labor markets are informal, and also small and medium enterprises are informal. This has enormous importance also in terms of access to education, access to credit, access to some kind of economic basis. And employment, you have many of our urban poor are unemployed, and then child labor is becoming now a very, very difficult. Both child labor and youth unemployment are becoming extremely important, especially in Africa and in the Middle East. Then, in terms of living conditions, all of us know about our terrible situations and the challenge of slums. The good work that Cities Alliance and the whole international community are really doing on slums. If there is something that is common to all the international donors, is really the fight against slums. People are really very committed to help as much as they can. And also the fact that one of the Millennium Development Goals is exactly focused on improving the situation of 100 million slum dwellers. The issues, I think all of them are also familiar. A question of poor coverage, and many of them due to lack of resources. The poor countries, especially where really the attention is now, which is Africa. Really many of those cities have very, very limited resources. Now, the mayor of Maputo last week was telling me, what do you want me to do? I have $5 per capita, for my budget. What can I do? I cannot do anything. It would not even help me to extend my water connections to those poor people, much less to improve their housing. So really, this is one of the most excruciating questions about how enabled we are to deal with the immensity of the problems. Again, you have the poor urban in higher risk in both in locations. There's also pollution and AIDS, smaller mobility. Many of them are very far from labor markets, and segregation, discrimination. So these are issues that are probably very, very difficult to handle, but are issues that we believe that if you do not tackle them, any improvement, even in the physical conditions, would not really have sustainable impact. The regional characteristics, as I mentioned, what we see is an enormous challenge in sub-Saharan Africa. It is 70% of the urban residents in Africa are poor. This is, has enormous impact in all kind of things. There is the highest incidence in slums. Probably some of you would see the slums, in Kenya, for example, near Nairobi, the Kibera one, which is really a world in itself with more than 1 million people, and the very, very interesting socioeconomic characteristics. Very limited access to pipe water with all the health impact that is mentioned. So probably Sub-Saharan is really the place where the attention of the international community is focused, but the solutions are not really easy. South Asia, again, a very important dimension. I believe the South Asia question is easier to solve, especially because we have growth. You have China growing it extremely fast, and you have India also with very important slums, but India is also growing very fast. And also the Indian slums are organized, you have good scholars, so in terms of the analytics, I think, we can really see the South Asian urban poverty in a lighter color than in Africa. This is my personal opinion. East Asia and Pacific, again, is extremely urbanized, extremely fast. You have lots of urbanization problems, but I think it's more transitional. Are people coming from the rural side to go to the city side, looking for better jobs? Sooner or later, these people are going to be integrated. You see already in China and in Thailand and in many other countries, Vietnam, the poor that are coming to town being really embraced and consolidated into the new towns. And then, you have our more consolidated continents like the Middle East and North Africa and Latin America and Europe and Central Asia, where there are countries that are more urbanized, where the cities have been already consolidated, and there the problems are much more of resources and public management and how to deal with the urban poverty that is really becoming consolidated and not easily integrated, especially because some of the countries are really facing very slow growth. So, and when the growth is slow, it's much more difficult to absorb the new people coming to town. So what we did with what we have been learning, first, that the MDGs helped to put the urban poor issue in the agenda. The fact that, one of the targets mentioned the urban poor was very important. One thing that was very encouraging for us is that for more than 50 countries, especially in Africa, and that are eligible for concessional aid, these countries have been encouraged to produce what they call the poverty reduction strategies. These are very important documents that really provide the kind of the blueprint for all donors to design their programs. The idea is that they would provide a consistency and would avoid that donors would finance purposes at odds with each other. What is interesting and a little bit sad is if you look at these PRS, and they're now for more than 50 countries, and all of them poor, probably less than $700 per capita, urban poverty is not mentioned. And if it's mentioned, it's because one or two of us just to start banging saying that it is immoral not to have urban poverty mentioned in these reports. So no, it's just to show that the analysis of the economic, the poverty issue is not really automatically look at the urban poor. Again, in part of what we have in terms of lessons, some of interesting progress in some countries like Brazil, Egypt, Mexico, South Africa, and Thailand and Tunisia in terms of halting the expansion of slums with extremely intelligent land policies and very committed policies. And again, when we do urban programs, what are the three legs that we tend to address? Infrastructure, and we already mentioned about water and slums. Income is extremely important. In income, we mentioned especially two things. The opportunities of people really to get into the labor force, and also the part of the assets. Most of the urban poor do not have neither assets nor opportunities. They don't assets because they are poor. They just came, or they just inherit nothing, and therefore one of the things that has been more advocated and we subscribe is about land titling, or having the housing and the shelter to be seen as an initial asset for the poor. And there's been lots of discussions about what kind of form can take, but I think my personal opinion is that the housing can really have a very important role in terms of asset starting. And then the other one is the opportunities. And one thing that I'd like to share with you is in terms of opportunities. As one thing that we have found in our programs is offering the capacity for women to enter into labor force. Many of the urban poor are organized in households that are headed by single mothers, and these people cannot really have their participation in the labor force. So having social programs with childcare that really enable women to participate in labor force has really produced quite interesting results. We have some examples in Salvador da Bahia in Brazil, where really we did with Italian aid that really produced very interesting results. And then the safety nets, and these are programs that are not on area but most national. And we have the case of Bolsa Família in Brasilia and Mexico, Oportunidades, where the poor people are directly helped by cash transfers. These, I would mention. Again, the other thing that would be interesting is about for to help the poor be the also capacity to extend microfinance and access to credit in order to be able to encourage people to develop their own business and skills. So now here, again, just to finish, things that, we would recommend in the lessons, and when we speak with our colleagues, from the agencies, first, the urgency to pay attention to cities and their role in development. This is what Susan had mentioned before, and I think this is where we start from, until we understand that cities are not really monstrous aberrations that are the consequence of policy failures in rural settings. I don't think, we can really even dialogue, with our agricultural colleagues. Again, distinguish transitory poverty from structural poverty. I would say that most of this stage in poverty, or the very high growth poverty, are transitionary poverty. People are coming to cities and they will be absorbed in the labor force if they are given education, if they are going to given training, if you are really giving health, if you given, the structural poverty is much more difficult. It's the one that really are, it happened, and in many countries, especially in African countries that are facing difficult problems, these are really where our attention is now concentrated. And support analytical work, this was already mentioned by Susan and Richard. We really probably do not know enough about what exactly to do in order to increase the efficiency of the urban poverty projects, and then improving effectiveness of lending. The idea is that let's go comprehensive. When we help a slum in terms of providing infrastructure, it will be a fantastic opportunity to really, we were accused many years ago of the Christmas trees. But unfortunately, I don't think that a single branch should go there. Focusing on infrastructure by itself will not really help people to increase in their own self-confidence, increasing the training, knowing how to insert themselves in the labor market, knowing how to cope with the segregation of being urban poor. So, the more and more, we believe that, while taking into account all the criticisms of Christmas tree and urban projects, we should really not miss the opportunity to reach out all the comprehensive parts of a puzzle when we deal with urban poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jessica?
Goodness, and I forget about spelling. I'm breaking equipment. My apologies. Urban folks need to get our act in gear, I guess. All right, my name's Jessica Toloto, and I'm with the U.S. Agency for International Development with the Urban Programs team. I need to start with a caveat, which is, although I am from USAID, I cannot in any way speak on behalf of the agency as a whole. So I may say some things that are very much in line with USAID's approaches and policies, and I'm going to say some things that are from my own personal opinion and my experience working with USAID over the past 10 plus years on urban and local governance issues. Okay? So just quickly, these are the issues that I hope to cover today. Some of what I'm going to say will very much mirror and reflect the comments that the previous presenters have done, and I think, though, I will also, though, have some difference points, but I think you'll see this as mutually reinforcing. Okay, so the first question is what is the urban agenda? And I think we've heard through the three presentations this morning, it can be everything, it can be nothing. Cities are a place where economic and social activity takes place. So you could be talking about health, you can be talking about infrastructure, you can be talking about jobs. And that's one of the dilemmas we have in discussing what the urban agenda is, because one almost has to say what isn't the urban agenda aside from rural, and then even that is too, because urban and rural areas are linked. You can't entirely separate the two. Just briefly, I'd like to acknowledge this venue and what we're doing today, which is the wrap-up of the Comparative Urban Studies program. USAID sponsored this program in recognition of the challenges of poorly managed urban growth and the importance of addressing urban poverty, and recognizing that there is sometimes a bias amongst the donor community to believe that poverty is a rural problem, to believe that development is a rural problem. And our hope was to bring together leaders and thinkers from across the spectrum of urban development, practitioners from mayors to NGOs and community-based organizations, donors, and academics, to look at what is a very broad range of issues: urban security, health, water and sanitation, etc. And because urban, as I said, is a place, cities are a place, it's inherently cross-sectoral, it makes it difficult to talk about what we're doing. But we had hoped that this program would help us to define an urban agenda, would help us to say what is it we're really talking about, so that we can more effectively get our messages across to policymakers within the donor community and for USAID on the Hill, which is who makes big decisions about funding. And I think it was noted that there are competing interests. There are lobby groups and legitimate interests to address HIV/AIDS, to address TB and malaria, to address security, to address basic education, water and sanitation. Sometimes those are much easier stories to tell when you're talking about a sectoral agenda, a single issue, than it is to say, we're going to solve the problems of the world's cities. And if you're living here in DC, where we haven't even solved them here, it's kind of hard to make that argument. But we're doing our best, and I think we've made some successes. So having started with that, what are some of the major trends? I think that Mila did a very excellent job of highlighting some of the key issues and the statistics. The three trends that, when I give a presentation, I like to refer to are decentralization, urbanization, and globalization. These are really radically transforming the face of the globe, and, as has been noted, brings cities and local governments to the forefront. I think you really have to think about those three trends interrelated. Not to say that all countries are implementing decentralization and we need to look at the differences, but that the city and the subnational unit of government is really the place where we're often operating and where we're talking about really addressing the challenges and the opportunities. We do get sometimes hung up in the challenges, the problems, the number of people without access to water and sanitation, people living on less than $2 or $1 a day. But cities are also an opportunity. And economic growth generated by cities is important and valuable, and we need to understand or learn how do we help to harness that growth. How do we take advantage of a process that's happening whether we like it or not? And the role of cities and local governments is central to that. Last point is just to say that it's about partnerships. We're not just talking about local governments, we're talking about national governments, donors, private sectors, NGOs, and the community level coming together to tackle very complex issues. Since I'm from the donor, and that was what the title of this particular panel is, what then is the role of the donors? In my opinion, the role of the donor should be, although it is not always, as a facilitator, facilitating what should be a process owned and driven by local and national governments. And that we need to take a balanced approach, meaning, again, it's complex. You need to address issues at the national level, if there is provincial or state government, at the municipal level and at the community level. You're talking about multiple levels of government. It's not just going in and addressing, a particular neighborhood or a particular city. It's talking about looking at the enabling environment, legal and regulatory framework, the policy, and capacity building and technical assistance. Not just one or the other. You have to get the whole picture right. We're talking about loans and credit enhancements and public-private partnerships. How do we leverage the private sector? How do we bring private sector resources together with the public sector through a variety of means, and move away from, perhaps in some places, dependence on donor or public funding for infrastructure, which is a very key aspect of the urban environment. And we need to invest in, and I think this has been noted, we do very little of it, particularly in the urban arena, on research. And I throw best practices in here, but not to say we need to do more best practices. I will actually argue at the end we need to do less, but on knowledge management, which we do very poorly, and on transfer programs. And I will touch on Richard's comment of south to south. Not necessarily transferring north to south, but where we have those best practices, where we have those pilots, where we have those islands of innovation, how do we help facilitate the process to transfer that knowledge and transfer those systems and practices? And at the bottom line then is building local and regional capacity and focusing on building systems and institutions, moving away from a project focus, moving away from donors coming in to do something, but actually help build the institutions and the systems that stay in place to keep that going. I'll touch just a little bit on some of the things from a USAID perspective that we're engaged in these different arenas. At the enabling environment level, looking at the legal and regulatory framework. This list is not comprehensive. It's intended to be illustrative, but I wanted to touch on some of the key policy issues that USAID has been engaged on in many countries in different regions. And you'll see it looks very much in some regards like a decentralization agenda, which it is because of the focus of unit at the municipal or the local government level. Both administrative and fiscal decentralization. Some of the key issues are intergovernmental transfers. Having worked in Indonesia for 5 years, this was an issue of importance there. Having worked in the Philippines, no, it was an issue there. Just as examples, in both those countries, about 80% of the municipal budget is dependent on intergovernmental transfers. So it's really meaningless to talk about local government budgeting or own source revenues or other fiscal issues if you don't talk about the intergovernmental transfer. It is essential and it's important. Some of the types of things that we and other donors might try and advocate for in addressing intergovernmental transfers are the establishment of an objective formula, applying that uniformly across local governments without political interference, having a formula and an application that is predictable, regular, and transparent. In the absence of that, it is difficult to plan, it is difficult to budget, and it would be, if you are a local government 80% dependent on intergovernmental transfers, impossible to borrow. If you can't have any predictability, any transparency, any ability to forecast your revenues into out years, and most of your revenue comes from the central government, it would be impossible to actually go to the private sector or to borrow in any means. Own source revenues. We often advocate to increase the level of own source revenues, which is the authority to set fees, to collect taxes. And one of the importance of this is not just to increase the local government pie so they can invest in whatever services communities identify as priorities, but also to help establish an accountability loop. You pay tax. I live in Washington, D.C., or in my case, Alexandria, Virginia. I pay taxes, and for those taxes, I get certain services. If I'm unhappy with those services, I know who my elected officials are. I can complain to them, or I can vote them out. So going to Richard's comment that a lot of what we're looking at is governance issues, you'll see that threaded throughout. Property and asset management. Cities need the ability to make use of their municipal property, to sell it, to lease it, to use it as collateral. Financial management, just basic core governance issue. You've got to have your books in order. You need to be able to budget. You need to be able to keep track of your accounts, and you need to be able to report out at the end of the year, say this is what we promised you, this is what we've done, and someone has audited it, and it's for real. So all of these issues are critical to improving local governance, to reducing local corruption, and I think the comment that corruption and governance issues, one of the things I argued and my colleagues argued from my office when I was in Indonesia repeatedly, that decentralization, although some said the first service to decentralize was corruption, we also felt that it was the only real way to begin to tackle it, because it's more tangible, it's easier to bite the chunk off, and you can really do something about it. But you have to be conscious of it. And again, a prerequisite to moving towards market-based financing, which is essential in the long run. Other types of programmings, as I said, governance, service delivery, and general management issues. I don't need to go through all of these. The point is you have a range of things from kind of your core planning and budgeting to human resources management, essential. You've got to have some level of professionalism, some incentives for improved performance at the personal and individual level for local government officials and the bureaucracy, local economic development, job creation. And on the service delivery side, which is, as we like to say, where the rubber hits the road, many USAID programs are under our democracy and governance umbrella. But we address service delivery as a part of that, recognizing that folks determine whether or not their government is legitimate and successful and their elected officials are worthy of their vote as to whether or not the trash is collected, whether or not the buses are running, whether or not their kids are in school, etc. And just quickly, the cross-cutting issues: accountability, transparency, participation, and efficiency. Those are the kinds of things we want to see happening across the board. Just last 2 points on this item, because I think it's worthwhile kind of breaking this out. Municipal finance, and I've kind of mentioned this a couple times now. The need to move towards market-based financing, given the incredible needs for investment in water sanitation and other infrastructure. We all know donors and the public sector simply don't have enough resources, financial, human power, whatever it may be, to do that. But we need to figure out how to move towards that, and that involves legal and regulatory issues. It may include credit enhancements, and it also includes technical assistance. I think there are very few donors who really do a whole lot on this issue. USAID dabbles in it here and there, and we've had some successes. We like to trot out Ahmedabad in India, the local government unit guarantee corporation in the Philippines. They've been, to date, primarily limited interventions and one-off activities. One of our problems, I think, is similar to the urban agenda. We don't necessarily have folks engaged in development who really understand the complexities of municipal finance and all that entails. We work on kind of the lower level base issues of financial management, but not then how do you move beyond that. And the last is associations of local government, who are often the ugly stepsister of donor assistance. We tend to give a lot of lip service to the importance of associations, their role in advocacy, to be able to advocate to the national government on behalf of municipalities as to what they think needs to be done to change the policy environment. Training and technical leadership, communication, transfer, best practice transfers. Associations can play very important roles, but they are often short-shrifted when it comes to donor assistance in a given country. Again, drawing on my personal experience, over the course of about 5 years, I participated in every couple monthly